Well, hello and welcome. First, I'd like to thank the library for having me here, but just as important, all of you that were brave enough to show up to talk about Paranormal Illinois from the safety of wherever you're watching this program. So, as a quick test, if you're hearing this, please throw something in the chat room that you can hear it, that the microphone's coming through for you. Let's see if I can. Hate to go through the program and great. So my name's Chad Lewis. I'll be your presenter this evening. And although my background is actually in the field of psychology, for the last 25 years, I've been traveling the world in search of the strange and unusual. Everything from hunting for vampires in Transylvania, looking for the Loch Ness Monster, crop circles, UFOs, alien abductions, weird people, odd places, you name it. If it's just a little strange and offbeat, I've traveled around the globe in search of these oddities. But what I found on my travels is that sometimes the weirdest things happen right in your own backyard. So that's what we're going to explore tonight. Some of the weirdest and most bizarre paranormal stories Illinois has to offer. For the next 45 minutes or so, we will take a tour across the entire state. I'm going to provide you with the background, the folklore, the eyewitness accounts. I'll talk a bit about some of our research at these places. Heck, I'll even provide you with the directions to these places. But I'm going to leave it up to each and every one of you, whether you're a diehard skeptic or a true believer or somewhere in between, to venture to these places and decide for yourself whether or not you believe the legends are true. But I have to warn you, it's much easier watching these places on television than it is visiting. When you're out in the middle of nowhere and you see that shadowy creature lurking from tree to tree, you simply can't turn the channel and forget all about it. So with that in mind, let's explore some of the most paranormal spots in all of Illinois. First stop, here I am on one of my expeditions over at Loch Ness looking for the Loch Ness Monster. I'm the one in the blue without the really cool beard. Little did I know if I wanted to see sea serpents, I should have stayed in Illinois. Well, Lake Michigan, that is. Throughout the years, Lake Michigan's been the home of hundreds of sightings of something strange and bizarre. Old newspaper reports are filled with people seeing weird things at the lake. One of my favorite accounts comes from 1900. A bunch of construction workers, along with their horse and their wagon, were down by the water when all of a sudden they saw some giant leviathan of the deep rise up out of the water right near the shoreline. They immediately ran to the site and grabbed a bunch of tools they could use as weapons. They wanted to kill this thing because they didn't think any of their friends would believe they had just seen a sea monster. By the time they got back, the monster simply descended into the depths of the lake and did not reappear while they were there. Skeptics claim that it was nothing more than a school of carp or possibly an escaped sea lion from Adam Forepaw's popular circus, even though Forepaw did not report any missing animals. Hundreds and hundreds of reports come in every year of people seeing strange things in the lake. But they're not alone. The Mississippi River has a bunch of sightings as well. In fact, back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, people were terrified of the Mississippi River. They believed there was a giant monster or monsters inhabiting the river. They claimed that these things were 9 feet long, covered in a thick scale-like armor that a bullet could not even pierce. And then around the late 1800s, early 1900s, parents refused to allow their children down to the river. The reason being is they believed there were man-eating fish in the river. What was happening is mostly men were drowning. And when they would pull the men's bodies out of the water, they found many of them had deep scratch marks or claw marks on their calves and ankles, as though something grabbed them, pulled them out to their watery grave, and drowned them. But then the newspaper said, "Don't worry, we've solved the case. It's okay. You can go back to the Mississippi River. It's nothing more than a couple alligator gars swimming around." This is all well and good when you don't know what an alligator gar looks like. But when you see that this is an alligator gar, it's a little different story. Because if a garfish swims against you 10 feet long, you're going to think it's a sea monster. And in fact, it is. It's just one that we happen to know about. Many witnesses I've spoken with claim what they saw in the river was much bigger and creepier than any known alligator gar. But I'll leave it up to you to dip your toes in Illinois water and see what happens. This time of year, we all love ghost stories. And when a lot of people think of ghosts, they often think of cemeteries. The reason being is quite simple. Back when cemeteries were chosen, the land was thought to serve as a portal between our world and the spirit world. So when your loved one passed on, it would just be easier for them to travel from our world to whatever world you believe they go to. But regardless of whether or not you believe this theory, there are many places around Illinois where it seems to be working in reverse, that the living are not moving into the dead, but the dead are coming in to our world. First stop, Hillside, Illinois, Mount Carmel Cemetery. Many people are familiar with this cemetery because it's the final resting spot of that little known gangster called Al Capone. But even though Scarface is buried in the cemetery, many people go there for this woman. Her name was Julia, and during the early 1900s, she was giving birth. And unfortunately, she died in the birthing process, and as was the Italian custom, she was to be buried in her wedding gown, which you can see pictured here. But that's not the scary part. The scary part comes from the fact that as soon as she died, her mother began having strange dreams in which Julia came to her and said, "Mom, help me, dig me up, save me, I'm alive, I can't breathe." So her mother did what any loving parent would do, petition the church and the cemetery to dig up her daughter. And the plan worked, except it took her 7 years to get this permission. But she still dug up her daughter. And when she did, they were amazed to find that even though the casket was rotting away, young Julia looked like she was merely sleeping. It was so creepy and so bizarre, they said, "Hey, let's take a photo of it and put that on the tombstone as well," which they did. You can see here, Julia looks like she was buried the day before, but the casket's in bad condition. As soon as the story broke about them digging up her body, many people started referring to her as the Italian bride because they thought the place was haunted. Many unsuspecting people were out at the cemetery when they'd see what at first glance appeared to be a woman in a bridal gown, thinking maybe she's getting married and paying her respects to her loved ones. They'd get a little closer only to note that she seemed to be transparent, or she'd vanish right before their eyes. She's been known as the Italian bride ever since. But it's a great story. But is it anything more than an urban legend? Was anyone ever buried alive? Well, yes, we know thousands of people were buried alive. We know this because we have thousands of newspaper accounts dating back from the late 1800s, early 1900s. Now, back then, whether you were in a diabetic shock or in a coma, doctors would often pronounce you dead. But lo and behold, many people, some of which were even at their own funeral, would pop up just in the nick of time to be saved from being buried alive. This may seem a little silly today with our modern science and medicine, but our great grandparents were so afraid of being buried alive, they came up with several inventions to stop it. My favorite is this. It's called a cemetery bell, and it does or did exactly what it looks like it would do. It was a bell you'd have over your grave with a rope on a pole going down into your casket. So if you awoke and found yourself buried alive, all you'd have to do is pull that rope, it would ring the bell and alert the caretaker who lived at the cemetery that you had been buried alive and they could come and rescue you. But there was one problem with this invention, though. On many nights, the wind would set these bells off, giving the caretaker quite a scare, thinking everyone was buried alive. It was actually your responsibility to make sure your loved one was truly dead. You should sit around their grave for several nights, making sure that they wouldn't rise up from the dead and come back. But I love cemeteries where not only do you get a haunting, you get a little bonus as well. You'll see what I mean here. In Effingham, in the middle of nowhere, is Ramsey Cemetery. For decades, people have talked about this place as being haunted. Most people that go there report seeing weird balls of light similar to these, changing in size, shape, and color as they maneuver through the cemetery. Years ago, there was a small chapel in the cemetery that was used for funerals and other meetings. It is said that a distraught young boy went out to the chapel with a shotgun and ended his own life. Since that point, people would go to the chapel and report seeing what appeared to be blood oozing out of the walls of the chapel. Others swore they would hear the sound of a shotgun blast, but when they looked around, nobody was there. It got to be such a nuisance that the county tore down the chapel, hoping that would stop people from going out to the cemetery. But the story gets even more bizarre because in order to get to the cemetery, you have to go down several old roads. And while you're traveling down those roads, you will see a bunch of caves indented into the landscape. And it's here that many people see something that shouldn't be there, something that couldn't be there. So what are these people seeing? Well, maybe I better let you just take a look. This creature, for a lack of a better term, they called it a werewolf, the size of a bear but shaped more like a wolf with the long muzzle and the deep, dark, matted down fur. What's terrified witnesses that have seen this creature is that they report that it's a biped, meaning it runs and walks upright on its hind legs like you and I do. But don't worry, you're not the only people to believe in werewolves. Thanks to my good friend and colleague Linda Godfrey, my home state of Wisconsin is now known as the werewolf capital of the world. It all began when Linda was working as a journalist. She started receiving reports from people traveling down a small stretch of rural road called Bray Road. There, usually at night, but not always, people would be driving down the road when they'd see a similar looking creature to the Ramsey Cemetery one. Again, a long snout, large teeth, thick matted fur all over. Sometimes it's seen eating roadkill or freshly killed prey at the side of the road. But the good news is that outside of charging at a couple vehicles, these creatures seem to be just as afraid of witnesses as witnesses are of them. And rather than attack people, they seem more likely to scurry into the underbrush undetected. So the good news is, if you go out to Ramsey Cemetery looking for these werewolves, most likely you won't be killed. Well, 50-50. Pretty good odds. Give it a try at your own risk. But this time of year, people love getting scared, getting into the season. Many times they love going places and trying to spook themselves. They also love supernatural creatures like witches. But we all know witches only exist in Hollywood, right? Well, Hollywood or Chesterville, Illinois. This is Chesterville Cemetery, except the locals, they don't call it that. They call it Witch Cemetery. The legend is many years ago, a young woman was practicing witchcraft, the dark arts. In order to stop her from bringing evil spirits to the village, the town killed her and buried her at a grave at their cemetery. They planted a tree over top of her grave. Now, most people think trees were put up as a grave marker, and sometimes they were. But trees also were thought to keep a spirit grounded, that as long as the tree was there, the spirit could not rise up out of the ground. The legend today tells that if anything happens to this tree, whether it's chopped down, blown down in a storm, or it dies, it will release the spirit of that vengeful witch, and she will come back looking for revenge on the families that took her life. One of the dares at the cemetery is that if you go out there at night, especially at midnight, and touch the tree, the spirit of that witch will chase you out of the cemetery. People have gotten a feeling that they shouldn't be there in the cemetery. They've heard odd noises, weird sounds, and weird sights of shadowy figures in the cemetery as well. Unfortunately, the records as to who was buried there have been lost to history. Record books indicate that a woman was buried there, but that's all they know. But it must have been a pretty powerful woman, a witch, because not only did they plant a tree over her grave, they put an iron gate around her grave as well. Most people think that iron gates were put up to keep us out, but in actuality, they were often put up to keep the spirits in. The belief was and is that spirits and ghosts cannot pass through iron. So if you are afraid of somebody that you had wronged in life coming back from the grave, you'd put an iron gate around their gravesite or put an iron bar on their casket so they could not come back and get you. But she's not the only witch wandering Illinois. In fact, if you go to Ashmore, you'll find a wandering witch of St. Omar Cemetery. It's the same kind of story, that a witch haunts the area out in this secluded cemetery. People have seen her, people have heard her, people have felt her. But it all comes down to the fact they believe they have proof that she's a witch. And the proof resides in her burial grounds. Her name was Caroline, and the reason many believe she was a witch was the date of her death. You can see it was said she died February 31st, which is very hard to die on February 31st, even in a leap year. The reason they put it there was said that witches can only come back and haunt you on one night out of the year, the night they died, the date of their death. So if you put the death date as February 31st, this witch could never come back and curse you. Others believe it was an engraving error that was just too expensive to fix. But I'll leave it up to you and come to your own conclusion as to whether or not witches are roaming Illinois. In Byron, they have the Middle Creek Cemetery. I love this old, creepy looking crypt and mausoleum. It's the old crypt of a former senator. And when he died, his family built this mausoleum for him and put his body inside. But immediately people kept claiming that it was haunted. Young people would go out partying and drinking in front, talking about all the ghostly activity. The family was afraid somebody was going to break in and desecrate the body. So they had it moved and reburied in the cemetery. But that hasn't stopped the haunted stories from circulating about the crypt. One of my favorite legends is the dare. And the dare is that if you go up to the door and knock on the door, your knocking will act like some sort of supernatural doorbell, and you will hear knocking and rapping coming from the inside. Even though, as you can see, it's heavily locked, people still hear voices coming from the inside. But if you get special permission and go inside like I did, you'll see that it's empty. No one is inside of the mausoleum. At least not anyone who's alive, that is. If there are any parents watching this program right now, you might want to step away because you will not like this next case. In fact, non-parents watching this will not like this next case. This road is called the Death Curve. It's in Cambridge, Illinois, and it received its name Death Curve because the legend tells that if you drive out on this road and go around the curve, the spirit of a woman with a bloody axe will appear in front of you and run you off the road, thereby killing you, hence the name Death Curve. For decades, people had seen her, but wondering why there was an axe-wielding woman out on the road. So we started doing some research, found out that back in the 1800s, a family did live out on the farm estate, the homestead. They were the Markham family. And in the early 1900s, the mother, Julie Markham, went crazy. She snapped. She went psychotic. She told her two oldest and strongest children to go out and fetch water and wood for the day. When they were gone, one by one, she invited her 5 youngest children into the house, where she took an axe to them and killed every single one of them. When the 2 children came back, they were treated to the same behavior. Once Julie snapped out of her spell, she had killed all 7 of her children. I told you would not like this story. Then, realizing what she had done, she tried to slit her throat with a knife, but it was too dull. So she gathered what she could of her kids' bodies, poured coal oil all over them and herself, and lit her house on fire. This is not her house. Neighbors caught wind of the fire, literally, rushed over just in time to see Mrs. Markham running out of the house looking like some charred Freddy Krueger. She immediately confessed to her crimes before she passed away. Since that time, people have claimed that her spirit now haunts the place where she met her end. Many people who go out there see weird balls of light darting around the old fence post of where the house was located. One of the last times I was there, I brought my axe and put it in the fence post, hoping to entice the spirit to come out. Unfortunately, or maybe luckily for me in my life, she did not come out and grab the axe. Others claim that if you walk back to where the homestead once was, you will see a phantom house that will appear out of nowhere. The dare is that if you're foolish enough to go into the house, you will never return and leave the house. Several people claim they've seen this phantom house, but I have not spoken with anyone who has gone in, because obviously they wouldn't have made it out to tell me. Right down the road from the old farm homestead is the Rosedale Cemetery. It's here that many unsuspecting visitors report seeing the ghostly image of children running around the cemetery. Oftentimes, they wonder why they're there at such odd hours of the night or why these kids are not properly dressed. But when they go to get a closer look or communicate with them, the kids simply vanish into thin air. It's thought that the ghosts are those of the Markham children. They are all buried in an unmarked grave, approximately in the middle of the screen you see here. They're all buried right next to their mother, who's buried right next to them, even though she was the cause of their death. One of the most horrific cases you will ever come across, and one where if these things do happen out of sorrow and dread, ghostly apparitions, that is, you can imagine why there might be some residual emotions left over from this case. A little closer to home, for where a lot of you are probably watching this from, is the Caven Rock State Park, right along the Ohio River. It was a place where for years and years, hundreds of years ago, all kinds of pirates and robbers and all kinds of thieves would hide out here. Any unsuspecting people coming down the river would be hijacked and often killed, and all their goods stolen. So it seems no surprise why now many people think that it is haunted, that they've seen shadowy figures inside the cave. Legend is, if you pass by in the water, you will hear cries or screaming from the victims that are still coming from the cave. Even if you don't believe in ghosts or spirits, it's well worth visiting. It's a wonderful natural area and a place of both history and mystery. But if you'd rather not go looking for dead pirates, you may want to go to Collinsville for what people are calling the 7 gates to hell. They're a series of 7 tunnels running underneath railroad tracks. It is said that if you start to pass through several of these tunnels on the same night, weird things will begin to happen. You might hear your name being called out, but nobody's there. You might be tapped on the shoulder, but nobody's there, or see shadowy figures. It is said that if you pass through 3 or 4 of these, you will come face to face with what many people are calling the hellhounds of the gates of hell. Hellhounds, if you're not familiar, are large black dogs with glowing red eyes. They've been reported throughout history in nearly every culture on the planet. Many believe they do the devil's bidding, that they are a harbinger of death. If you see one, it means death is coming for you or someone you know very quickly. But again, you're not the only ones to believe in hellhounds. A few years back, I was over in Central America. I was in the jungles over there looking for a jungle protector they call the Tata Duende. Everywhere I went looking for this diminutive backward-footed creature, villagers said, you better get back here before nightfall, because if you're not back before the sun goes down, you might encounter one of our hellhounds. They called them cadeos. They believed these things had supernatural powers, that if they saw you, they would slowly steal your energy. And unless you could find a powerful shaman or a bush doctor to remove the curse, you'd be dead within a week of seeing these monsters. So being the researchers that we were, we made it a point to stay out past dark every night. And knock on wood, I'm still here today. But back to the gates of hell. If you survive seeing these phantom hellhounds, keep going on your expedition, because the legend is that if you pass through all 7 gates in one night, you will see, believe it or not, what appears to be a portal to hell that will open up and swallow you in. Those who have seen it claim that when they looked in, they could feel an intense heat rising up. They could see flames. Unfortunately, most did not stick around long enough to find out if it truly was a portal to hell. They were a little shy and embarrassed about reporting it because they knew how it sounded. A portal to hell in Illinois? But what these witnesses didn't realize is that over the last couple decades, I've collected several stories of similar portals throughout the state. In fact, I'm just waiting for that national headline to come out, Illinois, Portal to Hell. But if you'd rather not go looking for portals to the underworld, I suggest you take a different type of approach to hell, and that is visiting our next location. Many of you are familiar with Rosemary's Baby. Might not be familiar of a real life case in Illinois. Right outside of Chicago at the university is the Jane Addams Hull House. Jane Addams, as most people know, was a lover of children, a supporter. She helped many children throughout her life. So the story goes that many, many years ago, a young couple was pregnant. The wife was very religious, very devout, and she wanted to put a picture of the Virgin Mary, some artwork of the Virgin Mary on her wall. But her husband was an atheist, and he said he'd rather have the devil's child than to have the Virgin Mary in his house, and he smashed the artwork on the floor. Seems a bit of an exaggeration or oversimplifying of this. Why not just have it in your house? Seems like a lot of work, exaggeration. But anyway, that's the way the legend goes. So he throws this down and smashes it. Fast forward a couple months later, when the couple's in childbirth. Well, I probably don't even have to finish this story. You know where it's going, because when that woman gave birth to her child, it wasn't a child at all. It was a devil child. It was said to be red with horns, a tail, and claws. And it could walk and talk from the moment it was born, and it loved to curse and smoke cigars. Now, as ridiculous as that sounds to us today, the legend tells that not knowing what to do with it, they dropped it off for Jane Addams at the Hull House, and she raised it upstairs on the second floor. People would often go by years ago and knock on the door, willing to offer money to see the devil child. People swore they could see it through the windows of the second floor. And even though Jane Addams believed the house was haunted, she said there was no devil child in the house. But you don't have to take my word for it. You don't have to take her word for it. You can take your own word, because they give tours of the house. You can go in and see for yourself. Although they usually don't talk about the devil child or let you upstairs, but many of the ghost tours around the area stop at the house at night, and people claim that they can still see something moving up in the window on the second floor. But I understand there's a lot of you who are not wanting to go in search of devil children. But some of you don't have to go far for looking for monsters at all. In fact, you can go right out your back door. For many of you, you might want to look for the Big Muddy Monster. Originally out of Murfreesboro, the Big Muddy River, which is named because it's a big muddy river. It is thought that the monster gained international attention and arrived on the scene back in 1973 when a young couple was parked down near the river at Riverside Park. It was just before midnight when all of a sudden they heard a screech or a growl from some creature they had never heard before. That's when the car filled with a weird stench. And as they watched, they saw what appeared to be a giant Bigfoot-like creature coming out of the woods, covered in a thick mud-like substance from the waist down. This 7 to 8 foot monster was approaching the vehicle. So the couple hightailed it out of there, directly down to the local police station. They reported some giant monster was at Riverside Park. So the police showed up on the scene, searched the area. Not only did they find weird tracks in the mud, but they also heard the growl and they could smell the stench. One of the growls was so scary, one of the officers dropped his revolver and refused to go back to get it. It was several hours later before he garnered the courage to go back and retrieve his weapon. This set off an international firestorm of attention. But the story goes back much further in the history of Little Egypt, Carbondale, Murfreesboro, and the surrounding area. Here's a newspaper account talking about a reward being offered in 1949 for a weird creature that was terrorizing the local ironworks place on the outskirts of town. Nobody could even figure out what it was, much less agree to a description. Some said it was smaller than a wolf. Some said it was a bear. Others said it was a giant monster. Nobody knew what it was, but as far as we know, the $100 reward was never claimed. After the 1970s sightings, things calmed down for a bit, and there were many other sightings in the 70s. That is, until this gentleman, Bob Ryman, was in 1988, he owned a junkyard on the outskirts of town. Just when people in the Little Egypt area thought it was safe to go back outside, he had a bizarre encounter. Bob told me when I interviewed him that he owned the junkyard on the outskirts of town, and him and his security guard went out to the back of the junkyard one night. They had been having trouble with teenagers robbing parts and taking stereos out of cars. So they went back together to confront the trespassers. That's when they saw giant red eyes of something big moving in the back of the junkyard. It was moving back and forth, grunting in some unknown language as though it was talking to itself. Bob finally saw it, and they said it was somewhere between 7 and 8 feet tall. He said the shoulders were at least 3 feet in width. The thing was staring right at him with glowing red eyes. Not a light shine, not a reflection, but light emanating from the eyes. His security guard asked Bob if he should shoot it, and Bob smartly said, "No, we don't know what this thing's capable of. Maybe it will just make it angry. We don't want to shoot it." So they scurried back to their garage, locked up the doors, but the creature followed them. Soon they started hearing banging all over the garage. Bob said he thought it might have been throwing big boulders or rocks at the shed, but he said he didn't think the thing was trying to hurt them because he felt it easily could have busted through a door had it wanted to. Instead, Bob thought it was trying to scare him, and if it was, it certainly succeeded. After the encounter, they found giant footprints around the junkyard where the creature was thought to have been seen. But again, you don't have to take my word for it. In fact, documentary filmmaker Joe Torre is doing a new documentary called Creature from Big Muddy. It will be out this fall, winter, or spring, depending on when he finishes it, if, of course, he survives the Big Muddy. But Illinois is famous for all kinds of weird creatures outside of hellhounds and the Big Muddy Monster, including what became known as the Enfield Horror. It happened in Enfield, 1973, when a gentleman and his wife came home late from a meeting. They were just getting situated when he heard something out on his porch. He had had trouble with bears out there before, so he went out to look, and when he opened up the door, he noticed this creature standing on his porch, several feet high, with 3 long feet and giant saucer red eyes. He immediately ran back in, grabbed his weapon, came back, shot the creature several times as it jumped or flew back to the railroad tracks behind the house. Mr. McDaniel said he hit it once, that he was positive he had struck it, but wasn't sure about the second shot. This 5-foot gray looking creature, escaped into the woods. Other people started seeing it around town. Skeptics claim that it was probably just a kangaroo that he had seen. But Mr. McDaniel claimed that when he was stationed in Australia during his service, he had a pet kangaroo. He knew exactly what they looked like, and this thing was no kangaroo. Said the footprints were gigantic. Soon, when the story broke, hundreds of curious sight seekers, monster hunters, and others swarmed on Enfield with their weapons. They had tranquilizer guns. All hell broke loose as people were looking for the Enfield Horror. Where it went, we don't know. Is it still there? Did it run off to another backwoods place of Illinois? Was it ever there? Was it a kangaroo or his imagination? Perhaps we will never know. But it's not the only weird creature. Not too far from where many of you are watching this is a creature called the Tuttle Bottoms Monster in Harrisburg. Stories began in the 1960s of people seeing what appeared to be a giant anteater-like creature. The problem was the anteater wasn't native to the area, and many people saw it. In fact, at one time, a bunch of young folks gathered a posse together out with their shotguns looking for it. Officer had to tell them to go home when they said they were chasing a giant monster. The area is also an area of weirdness in itself. Local historian and folklorist Brian Daniel, who runs Springhouse magazine down there, told me that the place was often during Prohibition a route for bootleggers to make their payments and grab their spirits, and that people growing up in the area were told to stay away during that time, stay away from the Tuttle Bottoms area. And now the monster is said to haunt the bridge. One legend is if you make a lot of noise on the bridge, the monster, which is said to inhabit under the bridge like some sort of bridge troll, will come out and scare you out of the area of the Tuttle Bottoms region. I love the Tuttle Bottoms monster because it's unlike anything else out there. I get a lot of Bigfoot sightings and I love them, but some can tend to run the same gamut of the same size, same color, same thing happens. But the Tuttle Bottoms monster, just truly bizarre. The last category we're going to look at tonight is that of UFOs, unidentified flying objects. Of course, skeptics claim that the only reason we believe in UFOs, the only reason we see UFOs is because of Hollywood. TV shows like The X-Files and Unsolved Mysteries, movies like Men in Black and Independence Day. That's why we see UFOs is because Hollywood has trained us to. But what you'll see here in the next few slides is that people in Illinois were seeing weird things in the sky long before Mulder and Scully were out there investigating. Back in the 1800s, there was a flap of UFO sightings. In 1897, we had the largest UFO sighting flap in America's history. Thousands of people in hundreds of Midwestern cities claimed that balls of light or airships were moving over their city. Some say they landed and they talked with the inhabitants but could not understand them. People would follow these as they moved from city to city. You could follow the newspaper reports as each town braced themselves for the passing airship. These stories continued on into the 1900s. Here's one out of Peoria talking about a mysterious airship that raced a crew of a train for 12 miles before it went too fast. And the stories continue throughout the decades. One of the more infamous stories are war balloons or stars or planets being misidentified, but many called them strange lights in the sky. In 2006 at the O'Hare International Airport, dozens of trained observers saw UFOs hovering over the landing areas. And we often give credibility to trained observers, firefighters, police officers, pilots, men and women that are trained observers. When they see these things, we often give it a little more credibility than just regular folks seeing it. In Grand Tower, not too far from you, was a big flap in the 1970s by the power station where many people spotted something that they thought was trying to steal the energy from the power station. But as I'm running low on time this evening, I'm going to end on a type of case that you have not heard me talk about tonight because it's a private home. And the overwhelming majority of people that contact me about a haunting, it's not about a serial killer, a mob hit, an untimely death, a murder, an accident. It's about their house being haunted. Some of them believe it's a loved one haunting their place. They smell grandma's perfume on the anniversary of her death or grandpa's cigar on his birthday. Others have no idea as to who or what is haunting their house. Believe it or not, some are not bothered by it. They don't mind it. They've become accustomed to it. It's part of their everyday routine. Others will do whatever they can to get out the spirit of their house. And I hope that if you take one case away with you today, that this is the case you take with you, because it's the case I want you all to recall tonight when all of you put your head down on your pillows to go to sleep and you hear the wind rustling outside your window. I want you to ask yourself, is it possible, just maybe, that wasn't the wind howling outside your window? And perhaps you too are living in a haunted house. If you want more information, my website has more than you could ever want or need by going chadlewisresearch.com. I hope your adventure doesn't end here today after the program. Grab one of my road guides. Go on your own adventure of Illinois. And when you do, I think you'll discover that you live in one heck of a weird state. And I mean that in a good way. You're going to see things you've never seen. You'll meet some weird people. And along the way, you might just discover that the scariest thing out there is often yourself. So with that, I want to thank the library for having me here. It's very rare that you can come to a program like this at no cost. You can check out a wealth of information. So if you like programs like this, let them know so you get more of these. If you didn't like tonight's program, let them know so you get fewer of these. But either way, they put a lot of work into getting me here tonight, and they should be applauded. I cannot think of a time in America's history where the library has served a more important role than it does today. With everything going on with the pandemic, societal issues, politics, libraries are the fabric that keep our communities together. They're a real treasure for any city that has one. So if you want to go to my website and grab some books, type in the coupon code LIBRARY and you'll save 20% off of any or all of my books. All you have to do is type in library. So with that, I'll stop my screen share and I'll open it up. If you have any questions, comments, or stories, you can throw them into the chat room, and I'll check out the chat room here and see if there are any questions or stories. Maybe let me stop my screen share. Here we go. All right. Doesn't look like any questions, but a lot of people could hear it, which was really good. Now, keep in mind that this is just the tip of the iceberg. You can't throw a rock in Illinois without hitting someplace that is thought to have a supernatural reputation for it. I mean, just in Chicago alone, you have H.H. Holmes, the serial killer tours. You have haunted tours. Down in Little Egypt, you have the Devil's Backbone that's thought to be haunted. Many places in Carbondale, Murfreesboro, and the surrounding rural areas are thought to have paranormal phenomena going on. So this Halloween season, you have no option but to visit one of these places because they're all around you. Have I investigated anything in Carbondale? I've been to Carbondale many, many times. Obviously, doing one of my latest books was on the Big Muddy Monster. But in terms of hauntings, I learned of a few when I was presenting. I think it was, I'm not sure, Jennifer, 2 years ago, maybe 3, when I was in Carbondale presenting at the library on the Big Muddy Monster and heard a bunch of ghost stories. Someone saying, what's the scariest situation you've been in? People often ask, do I ever get scared at these places? And my response is that if you go to these places and you're not getting scared, you're not trying hard enough. These are downright creepy places. Even if you don't believe in werewolves, if you're out at Ramsey Cemetery at midnight by yourself, walking down the road, it's hard not to think that every branch in the woods snapping is a werewolf coming up to attack you. Your mind conjures up images of this. So I'm always getting scared. One of the most frightened I've ever been was in Central America when I was looking for a creature called La Llorona. She's a woman that was said to have drowned her children and now patrols the riverbanks looking for new victims. But down there, they have a different twist on it that she'll often appear as a beautiful woman and then lure men into the woods, and she'll turn into a giant snake creature and devour them. So the only way to see her at night was to take what they called a crocodile tour, where you're in a little canoe in flooded water. You have to walk up to your knees in flooded water to hop into this canoe in croc-infested waters. And I don't know if I was more afraid of seeing La Llorona or all the crocs right next to me in the water at midnight, with the only thing we had was a little miner's lamp on the top of our head. And I was so frightened. I said to the person I was with, I said, if you're scared and want to go back to the sanctuary we were staying at, I won't hold it against you. Hoping that they'd say, yes, let's get the heck out of there, but they didn't. Have I ever spoken with ghosts or spirits? I have not. If there's a list of people with psychic ability, I'm last on that list. Most of the time when I go to these places, and every place you heard me talk about tonight, every place I write about, I've actually visited and investigated for myself. But normally when I'm there, little things will happen, if anything at all. Psychics I bring with me claim they've been pushed or pinched by these spirits, or will capture something on a ball of light or a mist on our film that we didn't see with the naked eye, or audio that, again, we didn't capture with the naked ear, but it appeared on our recorders. But for me, it's always very subtle. There's never anything where people are speaking in tongues and things are flying around the room, but it's always very subtle to make you wonder. I was just in Little Egypt a month ago, filming a documentary on the Big Muddy Monster, the one I referenced earlier. And one of the legends, or one of the stories about the Big Muddy, is that it was nothing more than a man in a suit coming out of the river, out of the water, scaring people. So I've always wondered what it would look like of somebody in a pretty good costume to come out of the water and try to scare people. So that's exactly what I did. I recreated it. How did it turn out? Well, I'll leave it up to you to let me know when you watch the documentary, because I haven't seen it yet. I don't know. It was fun scaring people, but yes, very fun. So if there are no other questions, I'll turn it back to the library. And again, I want to thank you all